Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights here again with Charles Araujo. How are you today?
I am great. Looking forward to a great show today. I've got no sleep, which means I have lots of energy. I know that doesn't seem to make sense, but that's how it feels. I guess it's just the adrenaline kicking in. So
Sure.
I'm ready.
And how's it feel to be full time over on the corporate side now?
Yeah, it's been so I've had my first week. It was a little bit wild. I mean, I had been doing the job under contract, so from a job perspective, it really wasn't that different.
Mhm.
But it was sort of, having to go through all of the benefit stuff and, something I haven't done for a very long time. So that was sort of fun and exciting and also, drudgery at the same time. But I'm very excited about everything that's going on, and it's just good to be, a part of a team and that's all I'm focused on for a change. So it's nice.
Excellent. Meanwhile, I was in Austin, Texas last week, which we're going to talk about as well. But
Yeah,
first,
exactly.
before we get into that, there's some interesting security stories that we actually ran into last week. And although, we're not technically in the security space, there's stuff that was in there that was interesting enough and broadly applicable to the CIO office. I think we would agree. And the first story we saw was from Chainalysis, uh, looking at the ransomware world and finding actually some good news for a change that last year was actually a good year for ransom payments in that ransom payments are down 35%, under $1 billion that have been tracked, that got sent out. So we're getting better at figuring out this whole cybersecurity thing as far as ransomware goes. And it seems like both we're a bit better organized on our side, and the black hat side is struggling a little bit. All good news there.
It is. I am a little bit shocked. Maybe shocked's not the right word, but I never expected the whole thing to be a thing for as long as it has been. I'm not a security guy, as we talked about. But I've often felt, and I know some of the attacks were very sophisticated, but most of the ransomware attacks on, at least on enterprise organizations, were mostly due to the lack of sophistication in the case of the enterprises. They just were fairly sloppy, and they didn't have good solid backups, and they weren't doing them routinely enough, and all those sort of things that were relatively easily preventable. I mean, there are definitely examples of the ransomware attackers getting smarter and better and making it very hard where they could lock down, including the backups. But that wasn't the case. I remember, my dad, if you haven't caught it from me talking about him in the past. He was a 30-year LA County sheriff, and he spent most of that time as an investigator, a homicide investigator, and a bunch of, and he used to tell me, it's like you see these television shows, and you always have these criminal masterminds, and of course they exist, but they're stories on TV because they are the fun, interesting stories. Most criminals are very simple, brute force. They go for the low hanging fruit, as we would say in the tech world, right? The easy victims. And it's been the same with this, right? For the most part, if you were a victim of ransomware, it's because you left a hole and you gave an opening, right? They're not going to go after, for the most part, see someone that was really diligently protecting themselves. And so, that's why I've long viewed it, but it has stuck around for a long time. And I think it's, what we're seeing here, and this is a big number, right? A 35% drop is a big number. And I think it's reflective of a few things, right? It's part of this, the sophistication. Organizations are getting their act together. There's higher levels of enforcement, or the law enforcement entities are finally taking it much more seriously, thanks to some very high profile attacks. And I think, the net of that is, if you do have your act together, it's much easier to just thumb your nose at these guys and go, we're not going to pay it. And that's what we're seeing a lot of this. So overall good news, but also, a cause for continued diligence, because they're not going to go away quietly into the night. So security will always be a major issue.
Yeah,
So I don't know if you had any other thing to say about it.
not really. I think it's great that we have this visibility. I think the stories of the past couple of years have definitely made people think more about their firewall and storage and backup strategies, even at the mid-market level, because they realize that there were people that will come after you just trying to get 100K or 200K just to go away and give you back your stuff. People now realize that they're targets. I also am a little concerned. I think from a geopolitical standpoint, like this stuff is so hard to tell, but obviously with a war like a Russia-Ukraine war, that's going to make it harder for Russia as a nation state to pursue something like something like ransomware at the enterprise level. So I wonder to what extent those pieces fit together. Way above my pay grade for sure. But I hope that this is a good trend and not simply a sign that some of our nation state ransomware attackers are simply a bit distracted at the moment.
Yeah, that is an interesting perspective. I think it is possible that there's some of that at play. I do think I don't think this is a calm before the storm. I don't think this is like, oh, this is clearly going to get worse. But I do think there's an important, and I guess this was what I meant by being diligent, is that
Mhm.
this isn't an issue that's going away. And I would argue that the enterprise attack surface grows every single day, right? Our distributed
Mhm.
environments, the use of microservices, our focus on cloud, introducing AI now are all additional points of vulnerability. And in fact, you sent over a story that I'll be honest, I a lot of times you send these ones that are really long, and I just use AI to summarize them to kind of get the gist of it. I actually read through this one because it's like I had to really get my head around it, and it's a story about who's it by from Watchtower, and this
Mhm.
is a group that I wasn't aware of. I think you've been following them a bit. That does this sort of security based research, and what's interesting in this particular case is that they looked at what are called well, I don't know if they're called this, but abandoned S3 buckets. And it took me a minute because when you say something like an abandoned S3 bucket, that sounds like it's sitting there and people forgot about it and they're paying for it and the data is still sitting there and somehow got compromised. But that isn't actually what they meant. What they meant is that at some point, somebody deploys something that is calling an S3 bucket. And then at some point, that S3 bucket gets decommissioned.
Mhm.
And so you own part of this equation, right? Where you're decommissioning this, but in some cases you may not own the other part. You may have exposed that bucket to partners or other websites or whatever to say, if you need access to whatever it is that's sitting in this bucket, this is where you get it. And so that these websites are still out there making these calls to this now non-existent bucket. And what these guys did is they went out and wrote a little hacky program to go and find those sort of requests, these quote unquote abandoned buckets, people placing calls to buckets that didn't exist, and then re-registered them. And that doesn't mean they got any of the data that used to be in them, but to a certain extent, it's almost worse because by knowing the bucket that somebody was attempting to call and the file within that bucket they were attempting to activate, they could put something with that exact same name on it. And now, in theory, these guys are researchers, but in theory, do an injection or some nefarious act with it. And so, my way of looking at it, what we were just talking about, is this is just yet another example of an attack plane that if you're a CIO, that you should be just really, really worried about. And this is so hard to detect because the company just shut it down. There's nothing there, but it just because somebody else has this call out there, you could be left vulnerable. It was just wild.
Yes, and they did not name any names, the Watchtower in their research. And I'm going to make up these examples, but say Palo Alto or Symantec, a well-trusted security company, had one of these buckets, and then the domain was still there and still perhaps hard-coded to various enterprise computing calls or military in some cases, as the blog brought up. Like that's the type of issue that comes into place, that your trusted security calls are calling to, yes, a bucket that no longer exists. So technically it's a null call, but because if somebody intercepts that call, knowing that domain, they now have a way to get back into your system. So yeah, it was a really interesting story for me because it just really emphasize the complexity of cloud computing. It is so easy to spin up resources and then forget one detail that ends up making you inadvertently a security risk for perhaps all of your clients.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, like I said, I read this whole thing and I'm processing it going, in part of my other life here or whatever, my wife and I had will have still an organization called the MAPS Institute. And while she's busy having babies, we've sort of let it run on idle, but it's all still sitting there. And we happen to use S3 buckets to serving up a lot of the content. And we have partners that we had built things with that are, calling on that S3 bucket. And to be honest, I think it's completely, now in this case, we still own it and it's still sitting there, so we haven't decommissioned anything. But we were talking just literally a few months ago about, well, do we keep this going or do we shut it down? And we decided to keep it going. But had we decided to shut it down, I wouldn't have thought twice about just like spinning down the S3 buckets, and that was that. And here we have our partner sites that would have then potentially been calling it if I didn't think that through. And now they have this vulnerability. I mean, thankfully nobody would care about us, but but to your point, when it's not us, but it's Semantic or it's some big company, Microsoft, whatever, that could be a major thing. It was fascinating, and I think it's one of those things that doesn't mean anything in the abstract, but from a pragmatic standpoint, just one more area to be aware of and to look at. And that, at least if you're like anything like me, our brains aren't nefarious enough to think that way. And so it takes people like this who, thank God, they've decided to use their talents for good and not evil, because, they think this way. It's just crazy.
Yes, it's a good thing. And just for the record, after they did this research, they handed all this information back to Amazon Web Services to be decommissioned properly. So, luckily, these people are the good guys.
Yeah, well, that was actually another interesting little tidbit on that. Is I guess I sort of assumed that AWS would automatically, they call it sinkholing, but effectively retire that bucket name, but they do not, which is a fascinating little tidbit. And on the one hand, when you're dealing in namespaces, they retire every namespace after it's been used, then we're going to suddenly have buckets with gibberish for names, because every English or natural language sort of namespace would be taken. But yeah, I mean, it just speaks to, as you pointed out, the complexity of the stack that we're dealing with and why it makes it so hard. Which I think is actually a great segue into why you are in Austin, and why I was not. I was actually, I have to admit, I was very sad. So you were at Zoho Day, and as a former analyst, Zoho Day is something I've been at for, I think, every year for the last 6 or 7 years. Always been a big fan of Zoho, always been a big fan of the ethos, always been a fan of their now former CEO, and hearing what they had to say. And one of the segue here, hopefully not too clunky, is that one of Zoho's always claimed to fame has been trying to take this complex technology stack, predominantly for the mid-market and small enterprise space that they play in, and simplify it, right? And to abstract away a lot of that complexity. I think that's been one of the things they've been excellent at. But there was some news, part of it being that Sridhar was stepping down as CEO. But maybe you can kind of give us the update, because you were there, even though I couldn't be.
Sure. So at Zoho Day 2025, both Charlie and I have found Zoho interesting as a company because they are a full stack company in terms of their technology. So, of course, they have their CRM product, which they are best known for, but they also have their own databases. They also have their own analytics products. They also have their Zoho Creator low code programming interface. They also have their own servers and their own actual cloud, which they store all the services on. So they have everything from their own hardware all the way up to developing software and analytics, which they really upgraded last year with their 6.0 product, which brings analytics and business intelligence and data science together. Now they are adding task-specific agents. So agentic AI, we've been talking about it for months and everybody's doing it. But I think one little angle that is different from Zoho's perspective is that because they also have applications across customer relationships and payments and invoices and payroll and a number of other areas, they can create these agents internally that go actually work with a bunch of their own applications right off the bat, whereas a lot of these agents in other application platforms are limited because of the lack of functionality inherent in that platform. And I think it'll also be interesting to look at the level of control that Zoho has over these agents over time, because they own everything from the hardware all the way on up.
Yeah, I do think it's going to be interesting. I took a few things. So obviously, for me, the big news, looking at it, was their agentic AI announcement. And so I mentioned this Sridhar Vembu, the now former CEO. He stepped down, but he hasn't left the company. He's now their chief scientist, and he's always sort
Right.
of been the sort of spiritual center of Zoho and really kind of crafting that vision of where it was going. I do think, there was no question they had to go here. I think they have been a little bit of a laggard. They've struggled, and in fairness, right? They're $1 billion company competing with the likes of Salesforce that does 43 billion in revenue, Microsoft, which is what, 80 billion or something. I mean, massive companies that they're competing with, and so the fact that they're even playing in the same game is a testament to their capabilities here. But it's tough, right? And so they have their AI product is called Zia, which is sort of like an overarching brand for all of their AI technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say it is largely lagged behind. It is interesting, not surprising, but it is interesting that they are effectively, I would say, following the Salesforce and now with ServiceNow's announcements last week, the ServiceNow sort of model and the Microsoft model of effectively sort of taking the ecosystem play, as you said, focusing their agentic solution on their ecosystem. I think in Zoho's case, that makes a ton of sense.
Mm-hmm.
What I found, so from a product standpoint, from what they've announced, I mean, it's early announcement, so we don't have a lot of details with it. All makes perfect sense. I think if I was a Zoho customer, and if you don't follow Zoho, one of their big pitches is this idea of Zoho One, which is a single price for all their entire application suite. And if you are buying into the Zoho ethos and you're using a full complement of the suite, it's sort of a no-brainer, right? Because assuming they execute, you need it to do that. What I found more interesting is going back to Sridhar, who tends to think like big picture, looking at all this. He made a
Mm-hmm.
couple of interesting comments, and I was curious if you caught it, because I wasn't there, so I'm reading it from this article. But if you caught it from stage and what your reaction to it was, because on the one hand, he sort of made the case that you just made, is that because they own the full vertically integrated stack, that they're going to be uniquely positioned to effectively tune their own models and to their head of, I forgot his name right now, but their head of AI, who's a really nice guy,
Mm-hmm.
has talked a lot about focusing more on SLMs versus LLMs and having this built for purpose sort of approach to AI. And so he sort of made, apparently alluded to that as a competitive differentiator, and then proceeded to talk about the fact that agentic AI is probably not going to be something that's going to be a differentiator, that it's being so commoditized that it's going to be something that is like free, and or that you can't charge a premium for. And those two seem to be at counterpoints, right? So I agree with the second statement largely insofar as that LLMs are getting commoditized, and clearly with Symphony AI, part of our rationale, at least in our business unit, is that we're not trying to develop our own LLM for that very reason, that we're letting the big guys build and we're sort of riding on top of that. But that sort of ran counter to the first part of his statement about the competitive advantage they have with this vertically integrated stack. And so I was a little bit confused about that. I mean, what was your take on that?
Yeah, it was interesting because at on site, Sridhar was very clear about being wanting to dig more into product, wanting to dig more into uh, developing AI, and perhaps leaving some of the operational aspects of the company to his obviously capable lieutenants, now really, I guess, peers in terms of managing the company. Guys like Tony Thomas, for instance, co-founder's been there forever as well. I did get to chat with Ramprakash Ramamurthy, who's
Yeah,
their AI guy at Ramp.
the AI guy.
Yeah, yeah, while I was there. And one of the interesting things he brought up was that Zoho was also working on developing their own foundation model. I think they were kind of inspired by what DeepSeek did and saw that the price to get in and at least do some sort of perhaps model based on some of the larger open source models that already exist might be a direction that they can go in and perhaps optimize on their own hardware, or simply provide a more secure way of supporting AI. Of course, security and privacy have always been a big deal for Zoho as well, to the point that they've even created their own browser off of the Chromium browser to provide a more secure endpoint. for accessing the web. So I think Zoho is really looking at trying to figure out how to own that part in that Zoho in the Zoho way.
Well, it will be interesting to see how it plays out. I think it's, at least in their sweet spot of that, mid-sized market or small to medium-sized enterprise. I think they've got lots and lots of runway. Again, particularly for those that have bought into the
Mhm.
Zoho ecosystem. So I wish them the best with that. But it also leads into another piece of industry news that I think is very related to all of this, right? So we had the DeepSeek that sort of opened everyone's eyes to you could actually do this a lot less expensively, and what happens when you adopt some of these approaches. And another set of research, this time a combination of from researchers from Stanford University and the University of Washington, actually did something quite remarkable, is that they created their own reasoning model. They claim for less than $50 in cloud compute credits, and they did it using distillation, using some of the techniques that DeepSeek talked about. And I take all of this with a grain of salt. These are researchers; they're not attempting to productize. There's a whole bunch of caveats to this, but it did the question that immediately popped into my mind. So let me take a half a step back. I just said I'm sort of on record of believing that I don't think that building your own LLM is actually, I think that's going to be a commoditized thing. I don't think that is necessarily the pathway for any organization except for the biggest ones to be really focused on. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and I believe, despite what I'm about to say, I believe that's true. However, I think there are definitely cases. I mean, the whole idea behind the small language model was this idea of taking a much more cost-effective way to tune a model for a specific use case that you could find a way to create competitive advantage around. And what this research, to me, kind of causes the stirring as like, wow, could you use these concepts of distillation, applying it in an SLM sort of approach for these very targeted specific use cases at the enterprise? And would that actually make sense? Is this in fact going to be a game changer? I don't know the answer to that. I think there's lots of issues, including licensing from the major players that, they could come after you, yada, yada, yada. But it was just, I mean, I absolutely encourage you to read the article. It is one of those moments where it's like, light bulbs start going off and you start contemplating different futures. So I don't know what your thought process was in all of it.
Yeah, I found it exciting, and I think I'd be scared if I were the likes of OpenAI and Anthropic right now, because exercises like this, distilling a model for and creating some sort of better, cheaper model, or same results, a smaller model, is a sign that models have gotten good enough that they may not necessarily have to get better. And I think this, just thinking about foundation models at a general level, we're talking about 100 billion parameters, but we only, like, the average person only knows about, call it 20, 30,000 words. So 100 billion divided by 30,000, like, that's a lot of combinations of stuff that may not actually be necessary for most thought processes. Like, frankly, do you know 50 different ways to use each of your 20,000 words? That's only a million. And, like, so, even, so 10 million, 100 million, a billion, like, you probably top off at, the number of real ideas you need to be able to work with a specific domain in that couple billion range, I would guess. And if you can distill all these foundation models to something that is more aligned to your specific problem or your specific set of questions, you could probably get the same results for much cheaper and much smaller and much faster than these big companies are doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's the part that's intriguing. And what I would encourage you, if you're a CIO or if you're, working in like an office with the CIO and you're sort of exploring all this stuff, is you need to, I think, be very cognizant of playing both sides of this, because this goes back to the whole open source AI conversation, right? Because what I think we're going to rapidly find is that the cost of training isn't going to become the determining factor of anything any longer, as we really think about this, regardless of if I'm using open source, or if I'm distilling, or if I'm actually paying for one of the open AIs or the Googles, Microsoft's version of it because I decided it's safer. That's not going to be the biggest issue. It's going to be how you apply it, the inference cost, the ongoing elements of it. And I think that's what's going to what to me this is really doing is it's forcing a shift in the conversation, right? To moving away from the technology and focusing on the value, focusing on the business equation of how do we extract value from this and what do we need to actually do that. And in some cases, the answer may be we can be purely commoditized, but in many cases, just like open source, where theoretically the software was all free, it was all the other stuff that you had to do with it that made it complicated. And we're going to talk about some other stories that sort of reinforce this. And so I think it's a fantastic thought exercise. It's a fantastic process of really examining how we create value and where the costs are going to be. But it definitely, at least if nothing else, challenges some of these misconceptions, or at least some of the beliefs that have held true thus far. So, which also leads to our last piece of transitional industry news. And this is transitioning between industry news and politics, because, of course, some of the big political news is that the Trump administration is threatening and in some cases activating tariffs across the board. And one of those is a tariff on the chip imports. And so the question is, what impact will that have on all of this, specifically when we're back to NVIDIA again? And I know you love kind of plumbing the inner workings of politics and the tech industry. So what is your read on all of this?
Yeah, we're starting to see that, at least on the tariff side, that the tariff story is not particularly reliable, in that we thought we were going to get these Mexico and Canada tariffs on February 1st, and then we saw, okay, now it didn't happen, but we're going to keep the China tariffs for now. And now the next threat is around putting tariffs on semiconductor chips from Taiwan that could be up to 100%. So it's out there, at least as a bargaining threat. So we know how Trump works from a trade perspective. He wants to win every trade. There has to be a winner and a loser. So he's always trying to push to be a winner. And so in that respect, good for him if he can get something good for the United States. But I do think that this means he is going to want to push tariffs on Taiwan, tariffs on semiconductor chips in the near future. Whether it's next week or next month, it's probably going to happen sometime this year. And I think CIOs have to think about take a hard look at what they are planning to invest in from a hardware perspective. For those of you who have on-prem data centers and are investing seriously in AI, that this is a time to figure out whether to invest or whether you're just going to rely on the cloud.
Yeah, I mean, well, and I mean, let's not. I think it's easy to pretend that somehow this isn't going to affect the cloud, but all those cloud
Right.
services run on servers, and all the servers are filled with chips, and so at the end of the day, this is going to have lasting ramifications if it is in fact enacted. I think the hard part, like if I was a CIO today, the last thing I want to be doing is investing in a bunch of surplus resources. The whole reason the cloud, won in sort of the minds and hearts of CIOs was the fact that it allowed me to to not have to do that, to not have to build a bunch of excess capacity. I could buy it on demand, particularly for these things that were volatile, that had unpredictable workloads and demands on the infrastructure and on the tech stack. And so this creates a really interesting, almost bizarre dynamic that we haven't had to face before. It's like, do you start hedging that bet? And it's going to lead to our next conversation here, because I think increasingly there's been this ongoing battle, for like the last 3 decades, with the CIO, the office of the CIO, the functional role, fighting to become more and more strategic. And I think part of the challenge, part of the reason that we're still having this conversation after 2 or 3 decades, is because I don't know if there's been agreement on what that really meant. I think for a lot of CIOs, it simply meant they wanted to have a seat at the adult table, so to speak, when the overall decisions of the organization were being made in that sort of level. But most of the work, the day-to-day work of the CIO was actually still in in the act of fulfilling the mission of the organization, not setting it, right? It was, how do I support all the other divisions within the organization, all the functional units, and make that work? And so the strategic play in most cases was, I want to be at the table when those conversations are being had, so I can tell you whether or not we can support that, or maybe even throw some ideas out there about how you can leverage technology to transform the way you're working. But this is sort of now leading, right, to a different sort of conversation where now suddenly, because tech spend is such a huge part of the enterprise budget and it has such ramifications for the enterprise's state of competitiveness, that a decision like this is, do I start stockpiling resources because we're concerned about tariffs, becomes a truly strategic, business strategic sort of conversation. And what I think is interesting about it is it sort of leads into what is obviously a political move, but perhaps a sign of things changing from the White House attempting to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm understanding what you sent over, attempting to convert the CIO position within federal agencies, which has historically been I guess, deemed a career position, to that of being a political appointee, which would imply that sort of policy angle. Am I getting that right?
That's right. So the Trump administration put out a memo last week, basically stating that they are redesignating the CIO position from a career track position to a political appointee situation, with the logic that CIOs have increasingly been able to implement policy that is contrary to what was originally put in place. Now, my political cynicism says this is a play to go against diversity, equity, inclusion, all that stuff, that the political football around being socially conservative. But I also think there's an interesting point here around what the CIO's role is in enacting policy. Like, to what extent does the Trump administration actually think that the CIOs have been able to push policy, and how is that reflective of how CIOs work in the rest of the world? Because there's always been these different schools of CIOs, as you mentioned before. The CIOs who just want a seat at the table and are order takers, versus the CIOs who are able to work independently and say, okay, this is my budget, and you're trying to do this, and I'm going to use creative ways to make that happen. There are definitely CIOs on both sides of that, along that spectrum, and it's obvious that the Trump administration wants to go to order takers that are appointed. And I think
Well,
that kind of
I think
shows in
that's
the
interesting.
CIO that they picked last week, who we were not super impressed with.
So yeah. So I think there's two ways, or two dimensions you have to look at this with. I think clearly, with the Trump administration, this looks like a power grab. Yet another power grab, another way to install people there that are going to be loyal to the Trump administration. So okay, take that for what it's worth, but set that aside for a moment. And I do think it is indicative of a pretty monumental shift, I think. And let's talk about something we haven't talked about a lot, mostly I think because we just couldn't stomach it. But we talked about when Elon Musk was appointed to Doge, and when they took the digital, I always forget, the digital service, the whatever, and they
Yes.
renamed it Doge, and we sort of talked about it, where it's like, oh well, this is a sign of how it was a lot of talk, and it was sort of toothless, and this is really, now they're just technology, renovation and modernization, and we were wrong. I mean, we were pretty wrong on that, because what we found instead is that Elon Musk, and vis-a-vis Elon Musk, the Trump administration, recognize that the keys to the kingdom were in the technology, that by using that as the pathway in, they could effectively seize control of these organizations. They didn't need to go through the policy work. They could just literally, grab it by the digital, fill it in, and
Yes.
take a stranglehold of these federal agencies. And so to me, this is sort of the the codification of that, of saying we want to install the technology leader as a political appointee because that technology leader has the ability to effectively has the keys to the kingdom. And so taking it again out of the sort of the Trump power grab part of this, from a CIO perspective, I think that's a sort of like a moment of awakening. It's like, yeah, within every organization, you're more than just a caretaker. You have a very prominent role because everything now runs through that tech stack. And so it's just sort of an interesting development that in the long run, take the nefariousness out, could actually be a very good thing for the CIO as a career position.
At the very least, it shows that we've said as a cliche, it's all about the data. Now, even the federal government realizes it's all about the data. And although I'm not a big fan of this end run around Congress and 50 years of digital law and all sorts of things that I could rant about for hours, I will say that this past couple of weeks have definitely shown without a doubt that access to protected computer systems and personal data is a vital part of the power of the federal government. The data matters, the transactions matter, and that access has definitely become one of the biggest political stories of our recent times, and that's a little bit surprising when you think about how data and computers were just sort of this seen as this niche thing, even relatively recently from a government perspective. Now the data is the government.
It is fascinating. I think that the big takeaway, if you ever wanted to be a government CIO, book your ticket to Florida right now and go
Chat up
make a visit to
Mar-a-Lago.
Mar-a-Lago.
Yep. Yes.
So if you're already a CIO, we have a couple other stories of things that maybe you should be paying attention to. We talked a lot about the earlier, the $50 model and what that might mean to LLMs and SLMs. And what I think is interesting is it speaks to this idea of democratization of these models. And there's an interesting article that you found in CIO about the Windows 10, Microsoft sunsetting Windows 10, potentially accelerating as CIOs are then forced to do some refreshes on PCs about what has thus far been a bit of a laggard, this idea of an AI PC. And if you're not familiar, the premise, and I personally think it's a little shaky, but the premise is that these souped up PCs are AI PCs because they have processors that would allow you to start running local models. And I say it's been shaky because I've historically sort of said, like, with some exceptions for edge use cases and what have you, why would I do that? Why would I want to be by running local models? And I still largely believe that. I think that there's a recipe for disaster in deploying local models on PCs. But I do think that, as getting back to what we said, as we see the cost of inference dropping and the ability to have these really small footprint models, where it's almost inevitably going to open up those use cases. And so I think it's interesting that this author, Paula Rooney, kind of brought it back to this focus on the AI PC and that we may see this surge. So what was your take on the article and why did you think that this was relevant here?
Yeah, the retirement of supporting Windows 10 in October is something that we've been expecting to happen for some time. But I think this is going to push Microsoft of course, they want to sell Copilot. They have spent billions of dollars already in AI and need to figure out how to monetize this. And from a cynical perspective, I think what is going to happen is that Copilot is going to be increasingly glued into Windows and take up more RAM and force us to buy these more of these 16 and 32 gig RAM machines just to be able to run Windows, because they have pushed so much into it, and then Microsoft will be able to claim all this new revenue based on AI, when really all we want is something that runs Windows. And
I'm not sure that's a fair criticism. I mean, first of all, there's no question that Apple's doing the same thing with Apple Intelligence, and we're seeing an increasing push there. They, from a privacy standpoint, are certainly trying to run their models locally or, moving in that direction. And isn't this the story of always that we've always had with technology? We introduce more features into the OS and into I mean, Apple again is notorious for this. That drives increased, power requirements, processing and actual power out of our devices, and so we kept having to buy bigger and bigger computers. I mean, certainly the laptop I run on is 10 times more powerful than the one I ran on just a few years ago. So,
Mhm.
I don't know if any of that's an issue, but I guess the question, if and you said that we saw it coming. I'm a Mac guy, so I don't pay attention to Windows at all. But I think if you're a CIO, I'm looking at this and going, how big of a deal is this? Does this matter? Is this going to be an impact? Um, and I'm not sure it does, other than I need a budget for it. I need to stick it in. To me, the big question is going to be, does this does this push me? Does this force me to start thinking about how I'm applying AI at a desktop level? And what does that do to my desktop? I mean, we are only a few years removed from the whole Chromebook movement, right? Where the whole idea was effectively going back to the dumb terminal, where we had almost no compute power because everything was in the cloud. And now we're having this talk about having souped up PCs because we need to be able to run local models. And I think it's this pendulum back and forth, right? So as a CIO, it's like, where are you landing on this? How do you build your strategy around that? And this goes back to really processing, how are you going to extract business value from these technologies, and what does that stack then need to look like to do that? And that's where I think the jury is a little bit out, and where I sort of see these AI PCs as a little bit of AI washing.
Yeah, and just from a pure math perspective, to run a billion parameter model, you need 2 to 4 gigs of RAM, and that pretty much ramps up linearly. So 2 billion parameters, 4 to 8 gigs of RAM. So you run into this barrier pretty quickly, where you're not really going to be able to run anything bigger than, say, a 4 or 5 billion parameter model on your PC. So that is not an LLM. That is these SLMs, these custom models, these distilled models that we've been talking about. So I think there's going to be, if they are serious, if Microsoft is serious about AI, they're going to have to get more serious about either distilled models or some sort of custom model that they are providing on these PCs. So that could be another road to innovation as well. Perhaps Microsoft just ends up accepting and really perfecting these distilled models as part of the monetization strategy.
Well, and I do think it's interesting. And so, first of all, I think we're going to see the longstanding battle in approaches play out between Apple and Microsoft. So
Mhm.
clearly, what you just described is exactly what Apple has said they're doing with Apple Intelligence, where
Yes.
we've got model components running on their devices. They are working very hard to try to minimize that load, and then doing calls. Right now, it's a call to ChatGPT, but logically, it will eventually be a call to an Apple-owned LLM for
Mhm.
big processing to happen in the cloud. And it's going to be this sort of virtual handshake where you, as the consumer, have no idea what's happening. Microsoft, again, sort of true to form with Windows, is sort of taking a much more of a roll your own approach. They already have, I don't know the exact number, but a large number of SLMs in their model library sitting out there in the Azure marketplace.
Yeah.
And so the foundation is already there for them to have that exact same sort of an approach. And so from my standpoint, I look at this, and if you're a CIO, well, again, this has just complicated it. If I'm thinking about what is the strategy, all I've done is now increase the number of moving parts, and I need to
Mhm.
now really be thinking it through so that I'm making the right investment. All that said, I don't think it stops me from buying. I think the same conversation about what level of PC I buy for an employee is going to be the exact same conversation I've always had. How important is the work they're doing? How intensive is it from a compute standpoint? That dictates what we buy them. I don't think, and that's where the whole AI PC I've always taken with a very large grain of hype salt, because I just felt like it was just slapping the AI label to try to justify a bigger spend. Um,
Mhm.
but I do think it points to the complexity of this conversation that if you're a CIO, you need to be thinking through, which leads to the last true conversation to have, another CIO article, which, given my role at Symphony, I am taking very much to heart. The title of it is "CIOs Are Bullish on AI Agents, IT Employees Not So Much." And the
Mhm.
gist of the article is that there's a ton of hype, and the hype apparently is landing on the executive suite. So according to this article, and this actually came from, I think, a PagerDuty survey,
Yes. Mhm.
but basically it's something like 53% of the execs, and a couple different versions of this, but a large number of execs are like all in, going, yeah, AI agents, they're the future. We're gonna be doing this right now. And when they talk to the actual people in IT, that the practitioners that have to make all this stuff work, they're like, maybe not, maybe not. And this speaks to, we've talked about this in the past, the underlying complexity of AI agents is not insignificant. And this is where a lot of the hype has made it sound so much simpler than it is. And I think this is going to be a real challenge for any tech company selling agentic AI solutions to try to have an honest conversation with the market, with your customers, about where you're really sitting in this, and is it, how simple is it really to do?
Yes, the hype of agentic AI right now is about autonomous agents that can take action and contextually figure out what's happening and going on, and frankly, taking over things like tier one help desk and basic accounting and all sorts of other tasks that come into that exist in the workplace. So it's a combination of reducing work and then providing kind of an agent or a set of agents that can perhaps accelerate your own work. But frankly, when you try to use agents at this point, you can create perhaps single task agents without too much of a problem. But do you really want it to automatically do what it's what it has figured out every single time without checking first? I think that's honestly a hard ask, because honestly, we don't know how all these agents work yet. There's no track record. There's no real way to benchmark a lot of this stuff, because we're literally creating these agents from scratch as custom task agents to begin with.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, we talked about ServiceNow last week, and
Mhm.
they released an ad, a very cute ad, actually. I mean, you gotta love, what I could do with whatever it is, $80
Mhm.
million marketing budget, or what these companies have, right? I mean, just a very well produced ad, and the same thing, though. It sort of conveyed this idea that there were like these hundreds of agents running around doing all this stuff autonomously, and I think this is part of the problem. It sounds amazing. If you're a business executive, you're going, yes, bring it on. And as with, and this is not unique to AI. We've had this problem, all the way back to, when Salesforce first introduced the no software CRM. Like,
Mhm.
it wasn't no software. It just wasn't software that you had to run on your servers. That's all,
Right.
right? But it was still software. It was still, there's all this complexity to it. And so, it's the sort of the same story we've had in the technology industry for a very long time. And so I think it's just again, not unexpected, but I think, I don't know why. Maybe because AI is at that stage right now where, what's the quote? Any sufficiently advanced technology seems like magic. I think
Yes.
AI and agentic AI in particular is still in that sort of magic phase. And so I think people are buying it, right? Certainly um, the more detached you are from the pragmatic aspects of actually making this stuff work, the more likely you are to buy the hype. And so I think, my big message, if you're a CIO, is ground yourself, truly understand the complexity, truly understand how much is going on, what those moving parts are, and place your bets very, very carefully. And that doesn't mean
Right.
that, the Salesforce or ServiceNow or any of those are bad choices. It just means you need to get past that hype and really peel back the covers to see what's really going on.
Yeah, I believe deeply in agentic AI, and both as an enabler and frankly, it will take jobs. But I think this year is really deeply about testing agents for the rest of the decade. This is a long-term investment to understand how this technology works in context of your business. So rushing to a deployment, in a month or two, just because finance says you have to have a 12-month payback period, or else, I don't think is the right way to go, because this is how your business is going to work over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, well, and I do think that's a great point, insofar as, one of the things that that I think is going to be a very definitive issue that comes up as people go down this road. And I agree with you. Obviously, that's our whole business, right? I mean, we're part of our whole business. We're
Mhm.
very, very focused. I'm super bullish on it. I'm super excited about what it can do. I mean, I think I talked about this. I wrote about the vision of some of what we're doing in my first book 10 years ago. I've been waiting for this future to finally materialize for a very long time. So don't take it anything other than me being very bullish. But there is a lot of work, having also spent most of my career in the enterprise on the buy side. That every organization has lots of these skeletons, and the skeletons are in the form of data that is inconsistent and all over the place, and with no governance or models of understanding provenance. And there's all kinds of processes that are all over the place, and the process map disconnect from how processes actually work. And all of those reasons why I have things like process mining and task mining and RPA that predates all of this.
Mhm.
There's a reason all that stuff has existed, and it doesn't magically get wiped away because we have this thing called agentic AI. And in fact, what agentic AI is going to expose is you've got to get this stuff fixed. And the people
Mhm.
that are going to be able to realize that vision, they're going to stand up on stage with one of these companies, are the ones that actually done the hard work of getting their house in order. So I think it's going to be for some interesting times, and we're going to see the sort of separation of the people that are getting all of it and are progressing with it in the right way, and those that are buying into the hype and left holding the bag, so to speak. Speaking of, if you caught the Super Bowl, we're recording this the day after Super Bowl Sunday.
Mhm.
Our final story is a complete hatchet job by a website called Defector on one of the ads that Salesforce had on their promoting their Agentforce technology. And it really, to me, was less. This isn't. It has anything to do with Agentforce as a technology. It has to do with the messaging, the hype that we just talked about, and the ridiculousness of this particular commercial. So, did you have a chance to read it, and what did you think of it?
Yeah. So first, I'm gonna provide my disclaimer. Salesforce is one of my clients. That said, this ad was really odd to me. Um, Both like one, the star power involved Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson having problems getting a reservation in a restaurant done correctly. Like just the entire idea right here is laughable on its surface. I'm pretty sure if Matthew McConaughey goes into any restaurant, he's going to get the best table and the best service. He's not going to get stuck out in the rain. But then the fact that this could be the fault of AI or bad AI is a little odd. I think that it would have been funny if they had some sort of big Microsoft Copilot hat for the rainy part, and then Salesforce Agent Force for being inside and eating. But it was a funny
Well,
ad. So yes.
if you haven't seen the ad, basically it's Matthew McConaughey sitting outside at a restaurant in the pouring rain. He's sitting there drenched, and he blames it all on the fact that the restaurant's AI was too stupid to recognize that his outside reservation should be moved inside because of rain. And then, and this is what the article goes on to, and then blames the AI for the waiter bringing him food that he doesn't like. And so this article, I mean, honestly, I think half the fun of this is that how hard the article went after Salesforce on this, because let's call a spade a spade. It was meant to be funny. It's a Super
Mhm.
Bowl commercial, which is always this battle, right? So you get a bunch of star wattage, you put them in a ridiculous situation, and makes everyone laugh, and you try to get a message across, right? So that's what they're trying to do. So let's not be too hard on them here. But what I do felt like the article was interesting because what it and I have to believe that this is just people not paying attention. An ad agency that knows nothing about AI, just saying, "I've got these stars.
Mhm.
What kind of situation can I do that will make this fun and interesting that people will talk about?" Um, because the underlying premise when Defector went through and sort of broke this down was brilliant, because they said, like, what this really speaks to is apparently Matthew McConaughey is living in a world in which he has completely given his life over to AI, that nobody has any actual cognitive thought here, that because he shows up and the reservation officers are outside and that's where the AI booked him, that's where he's going to sit, even though it's pouring rain. It's like, duh. And the restaurant is going to sit him out there, even though it's pouring rain, because that's what AI told them to do. And it's going to bring him food, which nobody orders with an AI bot anyway, but because that's what the AI told, it just like the ridiculousness of the whole thing just sort of keeps compounding, apparently just for the comedic effect of it. And then what I thought the most salient point of this article was, it says, and there's Woody Harrelson, who's calling him from across the street, again, comedic effect, but basically was saying, you have a choice. And the choice isn't to choose a better AI. The choice is to ignore the AI and to come out of the rain. So it was almost like an anti-AI ad. It was hilarious. So I highly encourage you, to watch the commercial. It was quite humorous. And then to read the article. And mostly just to process just how much hype there is and how it's so easy to get sucked into all of this. And, the miss for Salesforce, in my opinion, all due deference to your client, is that they missed a huge opportunity on a very large stage to really sell the real promise of AI, because forget the fail of the rain, all that, we're not going to use AI for any of that anyway. I mean, that's really not the prime use case. And so that's the big miss, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've seen Google ads kind of to the same effect, where they try to show how AI is involved in all of your biggest life experiences. And, honestly, there are certain things where I don't really need AI to be, at my wedding, or, the birth of a child, or my, college graduation. That's not the relationship I have with AI. I think that part of the challenge is that the AI tech, like advertising people, took lessons from the iPhone, which is a very personal technology. The mobile phone is very personal, but the lesson they took is that, tech should always be embedded into your personal life extremely tightly. And honestly, I don't think that's the relationship that most of us want to have with AI. We don't want to be stuck in an AI world. We don't want to be stuck in some sort of matrix dystopian situation. And that's kind of where the AI ads are headed, because they don't know how to describe the value proposition correctly right now.
Well, and I
That
do think it speaks to one of
multi-million-dollar
the
level.
yeah, and I think part of the issue is I think part of the challenge is, both, you mentioned Google, right? Google is doing this as well, like you said, and Salesforce. This is effectively a consumer ad for an enterprise technology, and that's the real miss, right? It's like you can't connect the two, and I mentioned ServiceNow's ad. Maybe when we publish this, we can include a link to that. Now, it was still full of hype, and I still, think it was way overblown in many ways, but at least it was trying to address it from an enterprise perspective. I don't know if you saw that one, but I thought it did a much better job of sort of conveying the true value of how we would be using these agents in enterprise context. Still overhyped, in my opinion, but a much better, much more realistic. It didn't have the big star power. It was cute, but I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge, at least if you're one of these big companies that has to try to communicate this because I really think this is like aimed at investors, right? That's why this is a consumer-based ad. I think that's a tough one. It's very tough for the average consumer to really understand how this technology is going to have an impact on the business that they're investing in, or whatever. And that's a challenge for them.
All right. So we put on a lot of hats that we don't have today. We put on our security hat, we put on our government hat, and then we ended by putting on our marketing hat. So kudos to us for wearing so many hats and having so many opinions. But on that note, that's been another week in This Week in Enterprise Tech. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, comment, and let us know what we should take on next week. And until then, thanks a lot and take care.